Okay, so today we're gonna we're gonna dive into some pretty interesting stuff. We're
Yeah.
looking at what a second term for Trump could mean,
Right.
and this is all speculative, of
Of
course.
course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not saying this is what's going to happen,
No.
but it's definitely something to think about, right?
Absolutely.
So we've got one source here that lays out a whole bunch of predictions,
Mm.
and our job today is to kind of sift through them, see what makes sense, see what the potential impact could be,
Right.
and just get you thinking, right?
Yeah. And you know what's interesting about this source is that it doesn't just look at what happened during the first term and kind of,
Right.
try to draw a straight line from there.
Right.
It actually talks about like a much more aggressive,
Yeah.
much more radical kind of
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah. It seems like
Yeah.
definitely seems like they're going for like a very specific vision,
Yeah.
and they're really trying to like shake things up.
Mm.
So one of the first things that jumps out is this idea of reclassifying 50,000 civil service jobs. I mean, that's a huge number.
It's a lot of people.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, basically, the idea is to replace a lot of these career officials with people who are deeply loyal to the president. So you can imagine a situation where the federal bureaucracy is,
Hmm.
much more aligned with the president's agenda.
So like a more efficient kind of
Right.
machine in a way.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Much more streamlined, much more efficient.
But is there a downside to that?
Well, of course, there's always a trade-off. You could end up with institutions that are less independent, a more politicized system,
Right.
especially when you think about things like law enforcement and the justice system.
Yeah.
And the source even mentions Pam Bondi,
Oh, yeah.
who's known for being very close to the president as a potential attorney general.
So that's pretty interesting. So we've got this potential for increased efficiency, but then on the other hand, you've got these concerns about, are things being done fairly? Are we losing those checks and balances?
Right, exactly. Because if the justice system starts to be seen as serving a particular political agenda rather than upholding the law impartially,
Yeah,
that's a problem.
that's a big problem. So let's move on to the economy.
Okay.
This source talks a lot about tariffs.
Yeah, tariffs are a big part of it.
Big time. We're talking 25% on goods from Canada and Mexico,
Yeah.
and even higher on Chinese imports.
Wow.
So what's the strategy there?
Well, it's a very protectionist approach.
Yeah.
They're trying to protect domestic industries,
Yeah.
reduce those trade deficits, but it could really hurt consumers.
Yeah, how so?
Well, because prices would go up on all kinds of things, electronics,
Yeah.
clothing, even groceries.
Right, so everything's more expensive.
Exactly. And then there's the risk of trade wars,
Oh, yeah.
which could disrupt global markets and hurt everyone in the long run.
So that new phone that everyone's waiting for, forget about it.
It's going to cost a lot more.
And then on top of that, we've got this idea of making those 2017 tax cuts permanent. Remember those?
Yeah.
They were pretty big, especially for higher earners.
Yeah, those were significant, and they were definitely tilted towards people at the higher end of the income scale.
Right.
And making them permanent could have some big consequences.
Like what?
Well, it could stimulate the economy in the short term, but it could also lead to a much bigger deficit and even more inequality.
Right, so it's kind of like you're pushing the gas pedal, but the check engine light is on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might get a burst of speed, but you're probably going to pay for it later.
Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about foreign policy.
All right.
This source suggests some pretty major changes on that front.
Yeah, it talks about reassessing a lot of our alliances and commitments around the world.
Like what?
Well, for example, it mentions the possibility of scaling back support for Ukraine,
Wow.
which would be a big change from the current administration.
Yeah, that would be huge. So what would that mean for countries like Ukraine that are really relying on that support?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it could create a lot of instability. It could embolden Russia, and it could leave a vacuum for other powers to fill.
Right, so the whole balance of power could shift.
Exactly.
And then there's Iran.
Yeah.
The source talks about continuing that maximum pressure campaign.
Right, which essentially means maintaining those tough sanctions, trying to isolate them diplomatically,
Right.
and putting a lot of military pressure on them.
So basically just keep doing what we're doing, but even more so.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's the potential fallout from that?
Well, it could strengthen our alliances with countries like Israel, but it also risks escalating tensions in a region that's already pretty volatile.
Yeah, that's definitely a powder keg situation. And then, of course, there's the environment.
Right.
This source doesn't paint a very optimistic picture on that front.
No, not really.
We're talking expanding fossil fuel production, rolling back regulations, basically putting the brakes on any kind of climate action.
It seems like the focus is very much on short-term economic gains, even if it means sacrificing the environment in the long run.
So it's like we're cashing in our chips today
Oh.
and hoping that tomorrow never comes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So let's bring it home now and talk about Australia.
Okay.
How might all of this affect our friends down under?
Well, the source points to a couple of key concerns. First, those tariffs and trade wars could really hurt Australia's economy.
Yeah.
Especially because they're so reliant on exports to China.
Mm-hmm.
And second, any changes in U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, could force Australia to rethink its own defense and diplomatic strategies.
So they're going to have to be pretty nimble to navigate all of this.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. This source paints a picture of a much more assertive, even isolationist America. So how might that affect global cooperation on things like climate change or pandemics? These are issues that really require everyone to work together. So it's a really complex picture with a lot of potential consequences.
It is.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about and maybe even inspired you to do some more digging on your own. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and stay engaged with the world around you because it's a pretty fascinating place.
Absolutely.
And it's changing all the time.
That's for sure.
All right, thanks for joining us today, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Expert speaker.